Hey, welcome back to JG3 Reviews. My name is James, and as you know, I like to review fountain pens, ink, and paper, and today it's actually the ink. And you may notice this is not a bottle, this is a set of cartridges. So what I want to do is show you the blue that came with these Scrivener EDC fountain pens that I reviewed a while back, because the ink cartridges that they included are their standard refills of 20 ink cartridges, blue, made in England, and I have found that this is actually a really great ink. So I want to share this with you because I know some of you don't like cartridges, but some of you really do, and you love the convenience. And for me, I mostly use bottled ink, but when I travel, I like to have the convenience of ink cartridges. So I thought this was worthy of sharing with you, and what I'm going to do is put it through my normal ink review. So we'll do some water fastness testing, some dry times. I'll show you how it performs on various papers and grades of paper, and I think you'll be pleasantly surprised. All right, so as I mentioned, these are ink cartridges, and they are your typical international standard short cartridges. And so what I expect from this is just a typical blue ink, business friendly and all of that. And it is definitely business friendly, but I find this to be a more interesting blue than is typical from just a standard blue international cartridge. Now, Scrivener is based in London, as I mentioned. The ink is made in England. I don't know if that's in-house or contracted out, but it is made in England, as are many good fountain pen inks. And the pens I'm going to use today are both the Scrivener EDC pens. This is a fine nib. This is a medium. Those nibs are made by Schmidt, as you can see on the paper back there, and are both really excellent nibs. So if you're interested in these pens, be sure and check out that review. I'll put a link at the end of this test. Now, as always, we will start with Rhodia paper because so many of you have this. And you can see that on Rhodia paper, this is a very well saturated, kind of an almost electric blue. It really stands out on the paper, very vibrant, and I like that. Looking closely, you can see there are no issues here with feathering or anything like that. You can also see that this medium nib writes quite wet, and you're going to be able to see that in the writing sample. And you can see, hopefully it's coming across on the camera, that there is shading. And that's what I like about this ink, is that you do, especially in this nice wet medium nib, you get some really nice shading here on Rhodia paper, and we'll see it on other papers as well. Now, you don't see it so much in the fine, so if you have a fine pen, if that's your preference, or extra fine, you're going to see that less. But it's still a nice, vibrant blue and well behaved. Next up, I have the Ayush paper, and this was written with that fine nib, as you can see. And still, you do get some shading here on the Ayush with the fine nib. You can see a little bit more in that sample. And again, it's very well behaved. Nothing came through on the other side. I have here my Dollar General notepad made in India, and you get a little bit rougher edges, I think, but it's not really feathering so much. It's just kind of some rough edges. It doesn't really go out into the fibers of the paper the way that feathering does, but there's a little bit of minor stuff. But you do have really good shading, again, even on the cheap paper. And again, no real issues here. Maybe just the slightest bit of ghosting, but no bleed through, no issues here whatsoever. Then here we are again with our Vietnamese True Red composition notebook. Very similar to the Vietnamese paper you get in composition notepads in lots of different stores and brands. Very good smooth paper. It accepts this ink very well, and you notice a little bit more of that saturation and shading visible on this paper than on a couple of those others, and it looks really good. I hope you can see that as well as I can here. Now we did get it's this line here, did get just a few dots where that ink came through to the other side, no bleeding onto the next page, but we definitely do have just the slightest bit, and that's from that wet writing medium nib. And now we get to the Tomoe River paper, where if there's going to be good shading and variation, you're going to find it. And look at that. You do see, even better, that shading. And on Tomoe River paper, you even get a bit of sheen in the spots where the ink was wettest. And that's cool. And actually, it's kind of interesting. You see it more in the writing from that medium nib than you do on the swatch. Don't really see much in the way of sheen there, but you do in all of the writing here with that medium nib. So on Tomoe River paper, really a great looking ink. All right, now I have to do a little bit of robbing Peter to pay Paul, getting into that ink cartridge. Here's our second pass and the third pass. All right, while we wait for that ink swatch to dry, let's do some dry times. 5 seconds. 10 seconds. That's still quite wet at 10 seconds. 30 seconds. 30 seconds drier than I expected. And 1 minute. Yeah, so 30 seconds to a minute, you are good to go. I think that's pretty good dry time, especially as wet as that was. Looking back at that swatch now, you can see the levels of shading and saturation quite good. You can also see really good behavior here because that's really wet and yet really didn't do too badly on the other side of that paper. Now how about a water fastness test? All right, before we check for results, just a reminder, this grid was written days ago, so it is well dried out and bonded to the paper as much as it's going to be. And this looks a lot like another ink I tested recently. It disappeared. Okay, so water fastness, not a thing. Just remember that. Don't sign your mortgage papers with it, but great for normal correspondence and things like that. You can barely make out. I'm just going to call that it washed off because you can just barely make out water and test. Maybe you'd be able to salvage the idea of what was back there, but if you're going to let your blue eyes cry in the rain, make sure you left your blue pen in the house. All right, now this is one of my favorite parts of an ink test. That's the chromatography. I just think it's fun to do. It's easy. You can do this yourself. And it's enlightening when it comes to ink recipes because there's always something going on that you didn't expect. You might not have expected, for example, the pinkish hue here inside this ink, but there it is very clearly on the chromatography. And that pink gives way to what is a very vibrant, that's where we get that electric, eye-popping part of the ink. Very vibrant blue color, and then that darker, almost purple blue that gives this ink a lot of its variation. You've got a couple of different discernible blues, a little bit of that pink shading, which might be the surprise to you, and then below that, there's just a little bit of residue from the chromatography as those colors moved up the paper. What are my pros and my cons on this ink? Well, the pro for me is the vibrancy of this ink. I think this is just a great blue ink. It really does just jump off the page. It's not a boring blue. It's not just a plain old school blue. This is a really nice blue ink. It's still business friendly, but it is dynamic. As you can see, it is a well-behaved ink on all grades of paper. So I went from dollar store paper up to Tomoe River paper and Ayush, and it worked great on all of them. You do get a little bit different behaviors. Tomoe River brought out some sheening, but it was well-behaved on all papers. It's reasonably priced. It's easy to get to. You can get to it on Amazon. I'll put a link in the description. And here in the U.S., I noticed the other day that Office Depot had both the Scrivener pens and their ink refills. So that makes it a little bit more accessible to those here in the U.S. Any negatives? Well, the only one I really have is, again, H2O behavior. It's just not water fast, and so you can't depend on it for that. But overall, I just really like this ink. It's a little bit more interesting. When I first put it in these pens to do the review of the EDC, which I do really like, by the way, it just jumped out as a really nice blue and a pleasant surprise. I wasn't sure what to expect, not having used their inks before, and I do really like it. It's really quite good. And if you're looking for the convenience of a cartridge, again, I'm not going to say about their bottled ink because I haven't tested that, but if you're looking for a cartridge ink that's really good and not a boring blue and has a little bit of life to it, check it out. I think it's a good one. All right. Thank you very much for your likes, your shares, subscribes. God bless you, and have a great week.